Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
With sexual harassment allegations against film mogul Harvey Weinstein, it seems more and more prominent figures have found themselves facing allegations of their own. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. It seems not too long ago that Roger Ailes, founder of Fox News, was hit with allegations of sexual harassment. He was forced out of the network. That was quickly followed by charges against Bill O'Reilly, who was also forced out. Events began to escalate and dam appeared to break. Suddenly, many in the media found their alleged misdeeds coming back to haunt them. It even hit national public radio with the departure of the head of the news division. But while these are high-profile cases, sexual harassment, especially in the workplace, is not confined to big jobs or the media. A recent survey of 2,200 part-time and full-time female employees between the ages of 18 and 34 found that 1 in 3 said they had been sexually harassed at work, and 81% said they had been verbally sexually harassed. We turn first to Dee Copeland with the Life Crisis Center on the Eastern Shore. Welcome to the program.
Hi, how are you?
Well, first of all, I want to get your own reaction to these very big, high-profile cases. We obviously have Harvey Weinstein. Before that, I mentioned we had Roger Ailes, and of course, during the presidential campaign, we had Donald Trump and his remarks about what was clearly sexual harassment of women. What do you make of this new focus? It's almost as if every day we hear something new.
Right. Unfortunately, it's not anything new. What has happened is these high-profile cases, because they're high-profile, now we're hearing about it more, and sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual misconduct happens more than we would like to think, and it seems to get the most attention when it is someone high-profile.
Are you surprised that it is broken at this particular moment, and why not before? Or do you ask yourself that question?
Well,
because it's been around for a long time.
Yeah, sexual harassment, assault, misconduct has been around for a very long time. And one of the things that it's different, there are some people, some women, some organizations now are more willing to have these open conversations and open dialogue. And sometimes there's this effect of when one person shares, it empowers the next person to feel like they can share and they realize that they're not alone. Because usually sexual harassment, sexual assault usually happens in the confines of the victim and the perpetrator. And it happens in silence. And so when someone breaks that silence, it almost gives the next person permission to say, I'm not alone. This has happened to someone else. I'm not crazy. That wasn't right what happened to me. And so for some women or men, they then feel empowered to come behind and to further disclose what has happened to them. So no, I'm not surprised.
Do you think that we're seeing a major shift, or do you think we're going to pay attention to this for a while and then it's going to disappear, or has it emboldened people, even if the media doesn't focus in on it, that there's something else now that's gotten away, we're not going to go back?
I would like to think that we're moving in the direction that more people are willing to come forward or more people are open to have a dialogue about sexual assault, sexual harassment, and what is appropriate and what's not appropriate. But I also do know that sexual assault, I know we're talking about harassment, but yeah, when we're looking at sexual assault, it's one of the most unreported crimes that we have. So while I have hope, I still think we have a long road ahead of us, and I think it does help that we're willing to have these open conversations and dialogues.
With the survey, by the way, I mentioned a moment ago, in it, and I didn't find a stat for it, but there were a number of women who didn't necessarily realize that they had experienced sexual harassment. I guess one of the questions becomes, what is that definition? And two, why is it that some women may wonder whether or not, or not even realize that something has happened?
Well, when we look at sexual, I'm going to use a broad term now. When we look at sexual trauma, sexual assault, it happens on a continuum. And so on a continuum, we have touching behaviors and or non-touching behaviors up to touching behaviors and everything in between. So sexual harassment falls on that continuum where it's unwanted either sexual contact or sexual gestures or innuendos, jokes, and it comes from a person that's in a position. When we're talking about the workplace, it can come from a position of a person that's in authority that then uses their authority to gain these sexual favors, so to say. Or it could even be a peer-to-peer. Again, it's in a workplace. So maybe that person's not my supervisor, we're peers, and it creates a hostile work environment in the sense where I don't feel comfortable or I feel on edge, but I feel like I can't say anything because it is my job, it is my workplace. And everyone has a right to go to a workplace to feel safe physically and emotionally, and to feel like that they're not going to be ostracized because they don't participate in a joke or in a certain touching or non-touching behavior.
How much does repetition play into this? I mean, I remember when Anita Hill, as a matter of fact, came out and talked about now Justice Thomas. And one of the things that struck me was it wasn't just a single incident, but there were a series of incidents that when you started adding it up, you began to get a much fuller picture. How much is repetition an issue as opposed to, say, a single incident?
First, depending on what that single incident is, some people might take that single incident and dismiss it and say, okay, well, maybe I'm being a little too sensitive. Maybe it's not what I thought it was, because many times we tend to like to think the best of people. And so when something happens that gives us pause, we sometimes say, well, maybe I'm overreacting. And so they might dismiss that one incident. Or maybe they're newly hired and they don't want to make any waves. Or they feel like if they say something, they won't be supported or believed. So it depends on what that single incident is. But sometimes that single incident is what the person thinks it is, and they still dismiss it, but then it happens again, and then it happens again. And then before you know it, sometimes the individuals feel like, well, I can't come forward now because it's been happening for a while. Or maybe some people don't define it as sexual harassment, and so it continues, and they feel like, oh, this is just par for the course, oh, this is just maybe how it goes, or this is just locker room conversation, or oh, this is just what men do, and I just have to deal with it and I have to put up with it.
By the way, do you find that to be prevalent in many ways for women to think that, well, it's just something that I have to put up with? I mean, I've talked to a number of women, and they've said, that's just part of doing business. We just have to deal with it, which sounds to me like really not acceptable, but they seem to just sort of come to terms with this idea that this is the way the world is.
Unfortunately, there are some that feel that way, especially if the woman is in a male-dominated type of profession or business. And so she may feel like, well, this is just what they do. I can handle it. I can deal with it. And maybe on some instances the person can. But they have a right to be in a work environment that is free from any type of harassing behavior, whether it's physically harassing or with words and gestures. But many do say, I can handle it, and this is just part of the work environment, and I can deal with it.
Survey I mentioned a moment ago said of the women who experienced workplace sexual harassment, 29% reported the incident, 71% did not. What is that a failure of? Is that a failure of the system? Is it a failure of women to, say, report it in a sense of fearfulness? I mean, what is it? Just we don't have those things in place?
I think it's all of the things that you just said, because that statistic ties very closely when we talk about rape and why women don't report, and the number of people that report versus the ones that don't report. Very close statistics. And so it could be that they're in fear of losing their job, especially if their job, that's how they support themselves. That's how you pay the mortgage. That's how you pay the rent. That's how you pay the car note. That's how you take care of your children and your family. And so if they feel like, if I come forward, all that might be jeopardized. Or maybe the work environment, maybe there's a culture where things like this are accepted and they feel like, well, who am I going to go to? Especially if it is the supervisor or if it is coming from someone that has a position of influence. They may feel like I don't have anyone to go to. Or the other piece is they may feel embarrassed or ashamed of what's happening and they are fearful. Maybe they have been threatened. Maybe there is some intimidation going on. So it really depends on the situation. And for some, they might not define it as sexual harassment or sexual misconduct, and so they haven't defined it as such, and so they don't report it because they haven't defined it themselves.
Do you think that part of that reluctance, by the way, is that we're concentrating on the fact that all this stuff is taking place in the workplace, but there's a continuum. I mean, when you grow up, there are all kinds of incidents in your life even before you even get to the workplace.
Exactly.
Do you think the fact that those experiences acclimatize yourself to the idea that, okay, there's this behavior, and then when you go into the workplace, the structure is different, but it's a continuum behavior?
That's a very good point, because we all have our roles that we play in our families and relationships, and when we go into our work environment, we bring, a part of how we were raised. We bring our past experiences, good, bad, and everything in between. And so depending on how I grew up and how males and females were looked at, what roles women played in the family, what roles men played, if there's any previous sexual trauma, for example, that could impact how a person responds to anything currently that's going on in the workplace, how women's position in society is defined within the family. So many of those things do contribute to what a person brings to the work environment and what they may speak on about or what they may be silent about. There's just so many factors that play into why a person may say something or may remain silent.
How significant is it to have, say, other women in positions of power and positions that are responsible? And is there a threshold issue? That is to say, if you have one woman who might be in power, well, that's great. But if there's like 11 other guys sitting on the board, you may go to that woman, but she's got her own issues. She's got her own position to protect.
And I guess that's a tricky question, because when we talk about harassment, we usually talk about women being the victims, men being the perpetrators. But what we do know is that the opposite can happen also. Women can be perpetrators as well, and men can be victims. And not all women think alike.
Right.
And so not all women support other survivors and victims and what they're going through. I mean, I've been doing this work for 15 years, and some of the worst comments to survivors come from other women.
What do they say?
Well, what did you think was going to happen? Well, why were you wearing that short skirt? Or why did you invite him up to your apartment? Didn't you know what he could have anybody? Why would he have to rape you? So sometimes we can't assume that women are always going to be supportive of other women or of other survivors.
Now, one of the things, by the way, I mentioned a moment ago with the opening, that we obviously been concentrating on big names, big jobs. But in the survey I mentioned a moment ago, something like, when we look at industries in terms of where sexual harassment takes place, something like 42% in the food, service, hospitality, very low, pay. Retail's 35%. The legal professions, 30%. So we obviously are focusing on those big jobs and the high-profile figures, but particularly at the lower end of the economic scale, this seems to be a real serious problem.
And right, and so it is not confined to just one particular type of job, low profile, high profile, in the middle, menial jobs, because sexual harassment, sexual trauma is a humanities issue. And we take who we are in all of these different venues. And so because of that, there is potential for these things to happen no matter where you go, no matter what your background is, no matter what your race is, religion, culture. It doesn't matter, because it's a humanity issue.
Finally, are you ever surprised at, I guess it's the grossness of some of the behavior that you see on the part of perpetrators? I mean, I must admit, particularly reading some of the stuff that's been going on about the big media types and so on, the actors and so on. My reaction is, what are you thinking? I mean, that's not something you would do, no matter where you are.
Right. Well, I think in 15 years I've been doing this
Yeah.
work. Unfortunately, not much surprises me anymore because in this job we see the worst of people and what victims have endured at the hands of offenders and perpetrators. And so I'm not surprised because I think we have to remember at the root of sexual trauma, sexual assault, sexual harassment is also power and control. And so people are using sex or sexual acts as the venue or the avenue to exert that power and control. And so, unfortunately, I am not surprised at what humanity and what humans are capable of doing.
We've been speaking with Dee Copeland. She's with the Life Crisis Center here on the Eastern Shore. We appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us about this, and hopefully we'll see some progress in the future.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We now want to turn to Mike Farlow. He's an attorney who specializes in sexual harassment cases on the Eastern Shore. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me here.
Well, let me ask you this. Let me also get your reaction to what seems to be a flood now of big names. Started, seems, a long time ago with Roger Ailes, and of course had Donald Trump during the campaign. But now the floodgates seem to be really wide open with Harvey Weinstein. What's your reaction? Why do you think we're seeing that?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to remember that this goes back a long, long time. You start with Roger Ailes, but I mean, think back, Bill Cosby, Anita Hill with the Clarence Thomas hearings. Sexual harassment has been an issue that's been with us for a long, long time. And there's been a gradual buildup of people who have been willing to ultimately reveal what's been happening. And we have to remember that the victims here have gone through some of the deepest, darkest times of their lives as a result of the people who have been harassing them. And when we get to Harvey Weinstein, and I don't think that we can view that in a vacuum, when we get to Harvey Weinstein and so many women come out saying, he did this to me, he did this to me, he did this to me, and these were women who thought that they were isolated, who thought that they were alone, and all of a sudden there are so many other people who are saying, yes, this happened to me. It reinforced the message that they were afraid to say before, which was, this guy is a serial predator. He was attacking us, and somebody needs to listen. And if you looked at social media right after people started talking about Harvey Weinstein, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you started seeing the hashtag #MeToo. And after you started seeing the hashtag #MeToo of women that never told anybody that they had been harassed or abused, all of a sudden we start getting reports of other people, other producers, other actors. Kevin Spacey, people have been talking about him. An NPR news director just this week, a couple of women came forward saying that he had harassed them when he worked for another news agency. And that reinforcement is what's finally letting people feel comfortable in their own skin coming forward with something that is really very private and has been very traumatic to them.
Do you think, by the way, talking about social media, do you think that's been a factor in accelerating this place? That is, that suddenly you can see a lot of other people who have been impacted, whereas, say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you might have felt isolated because you couldn't connect.
Oh, absolutely. Because, 20 or 30 years ago, when, again, the Anita Hill, when she came forward about Clarence Thomas, people would say, this man was a very high-profile lawyer. He was a judge. He's now nominated for the Supreme Court. How could he possibly do something like this? And Anita Hill was essentially vilified by the public and the press and the people in the congressional hearings for coming forward and telling a very deeply personal story. And today, because people are able to share their experiences and share it with all of their friends and see other people sharing that experience so they don't have to feel alone, it has really empowered people to be able to say, look, this is a serious problem. It doesn't just happen to people that you see on TV. It doesn't just happen in Hollywood. It happens right down the street. It happens in our schools. It happens in the places that we work. It happens all over. And you have to realize that the people in your life that you love may have been carrying this secret for a long, long time and haven't told anybody.
Well, speaking of Anita Hill, because it's something that we touched on earlier in the program, because I remember Anita Hill when she came out with her allegations, that there were a number of women who testified against her, who suggested that either of these things didn't happen or there was some ulterior motive, rather than being sympathetic. What do you make of that dimension of our society?
Well, your last guest mentioned it, that sometimes some of the most critical people of the victims are other women. I've seen it myself in court on many occasions. I used to be a prosecutor, and a lot of times defense attorneys would pick women for sexual assault trials, especially older women, because they felt that they would be more critical of the victims. And that's a shame. You know, when people don't just typically go around saying, hey, something really traumatic happened to me for no reason. Usually when they say that, something did happen.
So when someone comes into your office, says she thinks she's been sexually harassed, what do you tell her? What's the process that you go through? And is empathy for this person a key factor in how you approach them?
Well, you have to be empathetic to anyone who has gone through a trauma like this. People don't like to come forward and talk about these things because they are deeply personal. Sometimes the incident of harassment might be minor, but a lot of times it's a continuing course of action. It's something that has gone on over a period of weeks or months, and it's gotten to the level that they simply can't tolerate it anymore. And when somebody gets to that level, when they get to the level where they're coming to a lawyer, they have really reached the edge of their ropes. And so you have to listen to the person, let them tell their story, and then you have to tell them that sometimes these aren't the easiest cases to prove, and there's a process that's not exactly victim-friendly that they have to go through, because they need to be aware of what's going to happen and what they have to do to be able to meet even the bare minimum for the courts to look at it. You know, they have to file a complaint with the EEOC. They have to go through a process where their complaint is evaluated, where the EEOC looks at it and says, yes, there's something here, or no, there isn't, before they, in many cases, before they can even get to court.
When you lay that out for somebody, obviously it depends on the specific circumstances and whatever evidence there might be, but when you lay that out for them, what kind of reaction do you get? Because that must seem daunting once you start, you go into an office, you certainly lay bare your own personal experience, and then you get sort of the blind, I don't know what the blind side is quite the word, but this, okay, well, we can go forward, but there's this big hill to climb.
Every person's different. Some people are at the point where they're completely resolute. A lot of people say maybe it's not worth it at this point. It just depends on the person. And that's why it's so important to lay it out ahead of time so that they know what they're facing, so that they know that just reporting it isn't always enough. But that's what's so gratifying about seeing the people who have come out against these producers and actors and news people over in Hollywood and New York, is that they haven't had to go through that process. They've just had to reveal what's happened, and the market is taking care of issues. You know, Harvey Weinstein got fired by his own company shortly after people started going public with this. Now, it's not like people didn't know Harvey Weinstein was doing it for years and years. There's episodes of 30 Rock where they talked about how, you know, it was a running joke with comedians. But when people came out and put a name and a face to the person that he was harassing, it made it instantly available to everybody to see that this is somebody who was really doing that. It's not just the butt of some joke. This was really happening. He's a creep and he needs to go. And he was fired. And we've been seeing that over and over again in the past few weeks, that people who have been not just accused, but the stories of the accusers are so specific and they're supported by other accusers that they're facing what should have happened to them probably a long time ago.
No, we've obviously been talking about big names, but if you're somebody who's working for a company, how much support does one get from, say, fellow employees? What kind of reaction are there from fellow employees, both men and women? What kind of sense is there any support there? Unlike, for instance, what we're seeing with you have a high-profile name and you come out, and it's whether it's against Spacey or Weinstein and say, hey, this is what's going on, and suddenly there's all these other people come in that they support. Does that take place inside of a company?
Well, again, every situation is specific, and it's really difficult depending on some of the companies. If it's a very small company and one of, say, a handful of employees is saying, hey, look, I'm being harassed, they might face a lot of resistance from the other employees simply because, if the boss is the one doing the harassment, that's the goose that laid the golden egg. What are you doing endangering our jobs with this complaint? Other times, even in small environments, people can be very accepting. Maybe that happened to me. Maybe I saw that happen to somebody else. Sometimes a lot of what you get in companies is the sort of subtle warnings. At the Christmas party, stay away from so-and-so after he's had a couple of eggnogs. He might get a little handsy. And those are the sorts of things that you see in companies.
Why do you think it is that these kinds of activities may go on that everybody seems to be aware of or heard rumors about, and yet people act as if they're not happening except to stay away from this person at Christmas party?
Well, a lot of times it's that factor of nobody has specifically said what happened. You hear the rumors, it's just gossip. Maybe it's fodder for the rumor mill. But until somebody really says, hey, X, Y, and Z happened, he did this to me, and something needs to be done, in many cases, people don't do things about it. I mean, look at Bill Cosby. Bill Cosby raped dozens of women. There's no question about that. And lots of people in Hollywood knew about this. It was something that had been reported over and over again, but nobody really put all the pieces together until a comedian makes it a part of his bit. And as soon as that bit becomes viral on the internet, all of a sudden the women that Bill Cosby had raped started coming forward one after another after another. And sometimes that's what it takes is the specific issue to become public so that people can be aware of it. And when I say public, I'm not necessarily meaning public to the entire world. If it's in a business, public to the people in that business.
So if someone thinks that they're experiencing harassment, because I indicated earlier in the program, some women don't realize this might be the case. How are they supposed to, A, determine whether or not they're actually experiencing harassment, as opposed to some flirtation or whatever might be acceptable in some venues? And then what do they need to do about it? How do they assess their situation before they even say, come to you?
Okay. Well, from a legal standpoint, there's two types of harassment. There's what's called a quid pro quo harassment, which is what we've seen a lot of over in Hollywood. That's the Harvey Weinsteins of the world saying, if you have sex with me, then I'll make certain that you get a part in my next movie.
Pretty straightforward.
Pretty straightforward. Or if you don't have sex with me, you'll never work in this town again. Pretty straightforward. And that's almost always somebody who is in a position of power, who's trying to assert their dominance over people. It may not even be truly sexual from their perspective. It may just be an issue of exerting power. And then there's the hostile work environment, which can be from a boss to a subordinate, but it can also be peer-to-peer. And that's the kind that is much less obvious, much more difficult to assess whether the harassment is actually there or not. And it's important to remember that the harassment, whether there's harassment or not, is from the perspective of the person who's being harassed. The person who is telling dirty jokes in the office might just think that they're being funny. But to somebody else who maybe has had some prior traumatic experience, those dirty jokes aren't funny. They're very painful reminders of something that may have happened to them. And in those sorts of situations, the person who's being harassed should, first of all, never feel bad or ashamed about coming forward to anybody. Any business that's worth its salt has some sort of sexual harassment policy that lays out who they should report to, what they should do in a situation in which they feel like they aren't being heard, or that somebody is harassing them, or that they're in a hostile situation. And then the higher-ups can evaluate and see what's going on, because sometimes it may very well be a miscommunication between people, and it can be addressed very quickly and easily by saying to one person, look, you think that you're funny, but you really aren't. You need to stop it, and if you don't stop it, then we're going to take further action. But sometimes the incidents might be of a much graver sort, and it could be the Clarence Thomas example of placing his pubic hairs on top of a soda can and giving it to Anita Hill, something that's really beyond the pale, that is just overtly gross. And she didn't have any avenue at the time of being able to report that. And those sorts of things, if they're reported, they should be investigated by the employer. If the employer is the one doing the harassment, most sexual harassment policies have somebody else that you can report to so that it can be investigated, so that remedial measures can be taken.
How responsive are employers and that you found as you move forward?
I've found that employers are very responsive. Most employers want to make certain that their employees are happy. If an employee is unhappy, they're not going to be productive. They're not going to do a good job. It's going to affect the bottom line of the business. And that's before any lawsuits. I mean, obviously, no business wants to be the subject of a sexual harassment lawsuit, but it's a lot more basic than that. The employers want their employees to be happy. They don't want nonsense going on in their offices. They certainly don't want overt sexual harassment going on. They don't want minor sexual harassment going on. They want everybody to be a good employee and almost like a family.
What's the success rate of these lawsuits?
Well, by the time it gets to the point where it's a lawsuit, they're usually fairly successful, because they go, as I said before, they go through a process where they're evaluated by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which then gives a determination as to whether or not harassment exists and whether they can go forward with lawsuits. And so at that point in time, you've really got basically the government behind your back saying that it happened. But before that, it may not always be successful. And a lot of times these things never even get to the EEOC. They never get to court, because they're addressed either beforehand by the employer, or unfortunately the person has just decided that the process isn't worth it, and so they're going to find other employment.
Finally, briefly, do you think there has been a shift in the way we view this problem, and that because of particularly the high profile, that aside from us moving on to other subjects as this thing unfolds, that something underneath is going on, that maybe women are going to be more forthcoming, that people are becoming more aware? Is there a social dynamic change that's happening here, you think?
I certainly hope so, and I really think that there is, because, again, in the past month, we've seen so many people who have come forward, who've been emboldened by other people who have shared their stories, and so now more and more people believe that it's acceptable to share the stories that they have, and they don't feel that they're alone. And that's the most important thing. They don't feel that they're alone, and so they're able to tell what happened to them.
We've been speaking with Mike Farlow. He's an attorney on the Eastern Shore, specializes in sexual harassment cases. Appreciate you stopping by.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Frank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.